For 4 consecutive planting seasons, the residents of a quiet river valley treated her like the local punch line. They called her walls a monument to madness. They laughed when she sacrificed her prime soil for concrete and stone. But when the summer of 1993 arrived, the laughter stopped forever. The town of Oak Haven, Missouri, sat nestled in the fertile, sprawling lowlands of the Missouri River Valley. For generations, the dark, nutrient-rich soil had been a gold mine for those willing to work it. The community was tight-knit, bound by the shared rhythms of planting and harvesting, and governed by an unspoken hierarchy, where land equaled respect and yield equaled power. In the spring of 1989, that hierarchy was dominated by Abbott Steeves, a man whose sprawling 3,000-acre operation surrounded the modest 400-acre farm of Margaret Halloway. Margaret was a quiet, fiercely independent woman of 45. She had inherited the farm the previous winter, after her father, old Henry Halloway, passed away from a sudden heart attack. Henry had been a traditionalist, growing corn and soybeans, just like everyone else. But Margaret was different. Before returning to Oak Haven to care for her father, she had spent 20 years in Chicago, working as a structural engineer, specializing in fluid dynamics and municipal water systems. She understood the land not just as soil to be planted, but as a living, breathing topography subject to the violent whims of nature. It started in April of 1989, just as the rest of the valley was firing up their John Deere tractors for the spring planting. Instead of ordering seed and fertilizer, Margaret hired a crew of commercial excavators. Abbott Steve, sitting in the cab of his brand-new pickup truck, watched through a pair of binoculars as 3 massive yellow bulldozers tore through Margaret's lowest and most fertile 80 acres, the prime bottomland directly abutting his own property. She wasn't tilling the soil. She was destroying it. The machines were gouging deep trenches into the earth, ripping up generations of perfectly cultivated topsoil. By the end of the week, the trucks arrived. Not grain trucks, but heavy flatbeds hauling tons of jagged limestone quarry rock, massive rolls of heavy-gauge, galvanized steel mesh, and industrial concrete pilings. The gossip mill at the Rusty Plow Oak Haven's only diner went into overdrive. "She's lost her mind," Abbott announced to a captive audience over morning coffee, slapping his thick hand on the Formica counter. "Grief makes people do strange things. But I've never seen a woman intentionally ruin 80 acres of the best bottomland in the state to build a rock garden." But it wasn't a rock garden. Over the next few months, Margaret began constructing what the town could only describe as a fence, though it looked like no fence any farmer had ever seen. It was a bizarre zigzagging structure made of gabion baskets, massive wire cages, meticulously hand-packed with limestone, and reinforced with concrete-anchored steel pilings. The structure didn't follow the straight, efficient property lines that defined Midwestern agriculture. Instead, it snaked in a jagged, mathematically precise crescent shape, intentionally abandoning a massive swath of her own land to the riverside of the barrier. She was creating a deliberate choke point, a brutalist barricade that stood 10 feet tall in some places and sloped down to 4 feet in others, terraced with heavy clay cores. To the untrained eye, it was a chaotic, hideous eyesore. It looked like a military trench system from a forgotten war. Margaret Mayor Tayson Garrick said one afternoon, pulling his sedan onto her gravel driveway. Garrick was also the vice president of the Oak Haven Community Bank, which held the mortgage on the Halloway farm. He stepped out, adjusting his tie, looking out at the sprawling construction site. "I'm getting complaints. People are saying you're building a junkyard wall on the property line. Abbott Steve says the runoff from your whatever this is going to ruin his drainage." Margaret wiped grease from her hands with a rag. She was standing next to a cement mixer, her boots caked in mud, a rolled-up set of drafting blueprints tucked under her arm. "Abbot Steeves doesn't understand hydrology, Tayson, and my property line is my business." "You're not planting, Margaret," Garrick pointed out, his voice dropping to a patronizing murmur. "You've sold off 2 of your father's tractors just to pay for this stone. The bank is watching. You have a mortgage. If you don't bring in a harvest, you won't last the year. I'll have enough acreage left for a late soybean rotation to cover the banknotes," Margaret replied evenly, her eyes cold and calculating. "But this structure takes priority." "Why?" Garrick demanded, exasperated. "What on earth are you trying to keep out, or keep in?" Margaret looked past him toward the distant muddy waters of the Missouri River, lazily winding through the valley under the bright spring sun. "I found my grandfather's journals in the attic," she said quietly. "The ones from 1927. And I've looked at the Army Corps of Engineers' modern levee data. The town is blind, Tayson. They've built their lives in a bathtub, and they think a ring of dirt is going to save them when the faucet turns on." Garrick sighed, shaking his head. "There hasn't been a flood here since the 50s, Margaret. The river is controlled. We have modern levees." "Dirt levees," she corrected sharply. "Built for 50-year events, not 100-year events. The water is coming, Tayson. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. But the mathematics of the river don't care about your banknotes." Garrick left, convinced the woman was entirely delusional. Word of the conversation spread quickly. Margaret Halloway became the town's resident eccentric, the doomsday widow, as some of the cruelest teenagers began to call her. As 1989 turned into 1990, Margaret's financial situation grew dire. Just as Garrick had warned, the reduced acreage meant reduced profits. While Abbot Steeves bought up more land and traded in his combines for newer models, Margaret was seen at the local hardware store, buying clearance rack canned goods and haggling over the price of rebar. Yet the bizarre fence continued to grow. In the summer of 1990, she added secondary baffles, earthen mounds planted with deep-rooted switchgrass and native prairie cordgrass projecting outward from the main stone wall like the ribs of a giant buried beast. The town laughed, but Margaret kept building. By the spring of 1991, the mockery had turned into outright hostility. The novelty of Margaret's eccentricity had worn off, replaced by the bitter resentment that small towns often harbor for those who refuse to conform. Abbot Steeves led the charge. Margaret's monstrous zigzagging wall of stone, steel, and earth now ran the entire length of the southern border between their properties. To Abbot, it was a personal insult. It cast long, jagged shadows over his meticulously planted rows of corn. He claimed it altered the wind patterns and invited invasive weeds onto his pristine land. He decided to handle it the way he handled every obstacle, with money and lawyers. In July of 1991, Margaret received a summons. Abbot had filed a civil nuisance lawsuit claiming her unpermitted architectural anomaly was a hazard that violated county agricultural zoning laws. The hearing at the county courthouse was packed. Half the town showed up, mostly to see the crazy Halloway woman finally put in her place. Abbott's lawyer, a slick man from St. Louis named William Hastings, painted Margaret as an unstable menace. He presented glossy photographs of Abbott's perfectly manicured fields, contrasted with Margaret's brutalist gabion walls and overgrown prairie grass baffles. "Your Honor, this is not farming," Hastings argued, gesturing dramatically to the photos. "This is an industrial blockade. It is an eyesore that decreases the property value of the entire county. My client asks for an injunction to have this junk dismantled immediately." When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she didn't hire a lawyer. She stood up alone, wearing her late father's oversized tweed blazer, and placed a massive, heavily tabbed binder on the judge's desk. "I am completely within agricultural zoning rights," Margaret stated, her voice projecting clearly across the crowded, snickering courtroom. The structure is technically classified as a terraced retaining wall and erosion control system. Section 4, Paragraph B of the County Code specifically allows for masonry and wire erosion barriers on riparian floodplains. The judge, a weary man named Harrison, leafed through the documents. He looked at the engineering stamps Margaret's own professional seals from her time in Chicago. She has the permits, Judge Harrison muttered, much to Abbott's visible fury. The engineering is stamped by a licensed professional. It may be ugly, Mr. Steeves, but it's legal. Abbott slammed his fist on the gallery railing as they left the courtroom. You're a lunatic, Maggie, he spat as she walked past him on the courthouse steps. You're bankrupting your family's legacy for a pile of rocks. I'll give you 50 cents on the dollar for your land, right now, just so I can bulldoze that damn wall myself. Margaret stopped, turning to face him. The summer heat was oppressive, but her demeanor was ice cold. Keep your money, Abbott. You're going to need it to buy a boat. The victory in court was a hollow one. The legal fees, however minimal, had eaten into her seed budget for the 1992 season. To finish the final stretch of her wall, a complex series of high-tensile steel sluice gates meant to relieve hydraulic pressure, she was forced to make a painful sacrifice. In November of 1992, she walked into a jeweler in St. Louis and sold her grandmother's heirloom diamond ring alongside every piece of gold jewelry she owned. When Mayor Garrick found out, he shook his head in pity. She's officially hit rock bottom, he told the regulars at the Rusty Plough. The bank will have the farm by next Christmas. It's a shame. Henry Holloway was a good man. His daughter just lost her mind. Winter arrived, blanketing the Missouri River Valley in a thick, unusually heavy layer of snow. The frost sank deep into the earth. For months, Oak Haven was quiet, frozen under ice. Then came the spring of 1993. It began in April. A clash of weather systems stalled over the American Midwest. The jet stream dipped, trapping cool, dry air against a persistent flow of warm, moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico. The rain started. At first, it was just the usual spring showers, the kind that helped the seedlings break through the topsoil. But by May, the rain hadn't stopped. It fell in sheets day after day, turning the fertile fields into impassable bogs of thick black mud. Abbott Steve stood on his porch watching the sky with a growing sense of unease. His state-of-the-art tractors were useless, sinking axle-deep into the muck whenever he tried to move them. His newly planted corn was drowning in standing water. Still, the town wasn't panicking yet. The local levee's massive earthen mounds, built by the Army Corps of Engineers decades ago, stood 30 feet high between the town and the Missouri River. They had always held. It's just a wet year, Garrick told the nervous townsfolk at a Sunday church service in late May. The levees are strong. The county is monitoring the water levels. We'll take a hit on the crops, but we're safe. But Margaret knew they weren't. While the rest of the town huddled in their homes, watching the news, Margaret was out in the torrential downpour. Clad in a bright yellow slicker, she spent her days and nights walking the length of her strange, winding fence. She checked the steel tension cables. She cleared debris from the heavy prairie grass baffles. She greased the gears on the custom-built sluice gates she had installed at the lowest elevation points. By June, the soil across the entire upper Midwest was completely saturated. It couldn't absorb another drop of water. Every inch of rain that fell became immediate runoff, pouring into the creeks, the tributaries, and finally into the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. The river, normally a sluggish, muddy ribbon a mile away, was now a roaring, terrifying force of nature. It swelled violently, churning with uprooted trees, destroyed docks and debris. The water level crept higher up the town's earthen levees by the hour. Panic finally set in. Abbott Steeves marshaled his farmhands and heavy equipment, joining hundreds of other Oak Haven residents in a desperate, frantic sandbagging operation along the top of the town levee. Day and night they worked in the freezing rain, piling sandbags higher and higher as the river roared just inches below the crest. On June 25th, Abbott drove his mud-splattered truck past Margaret's farm to pick up more volunteers. He slammed on the brakes, staring through the rain-streaked windshield. Margaret wasn't sandbagging. She was standing on the reinforced concrete lip of her zigzagging wall, calmly watching the rising waters of a secondary creek that bordered their properties. The creek had already burst its banks and was beginning to pool against the far side of her gabion baskets. Abbott rolled down his window, the roar of the rain drowning out almost everything. "Maggie!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and exhaustion. "Get to the town levee. We need every set of hands. If the river breaches your little rock wall isn't going to do a damn thing, you're going to drown." Margaret looked down at him. Her face was exhausted, her eyes ringed with dark circles, but there was no fear in her expression. Only grim resignation. "The town levee is made of saturated dirt. Abbott!" she yelled back over the storm. "It's currently holding back 35 feet of hydraulic head pressure. The base is liquefying. Sandbags aren't going to stop physics. Get your family to high ground. Now." Abbott cursed her, rolling up his window and speeding off toward town. He thought she was crazy. He thought the town could beat the river. 2 days later, on the night of June 27th, 1993, the earth beneath Oakhaven groaned. The relentless pressure of the swollen Missouri River finally found a weak point in the decades-old earthen levee just north of town. It didn't overtop the sandbags. The foundation of the levee itself simply gave way. With a sound like a freight train tearing through a tunnel, a 300-foot section of the levee disintegrated instantly, vaporizing into the roaring current. Millions of gallons of dark, freezing river water violently exploded into the valley, consuming everything in its path. The Great Flood of 1993 had finally come to Oakhaven, and the town was utterly defenseless. When the northern levee ruptured, the sound was not a splash nor a roar. It was a deafening, earth-shaking detonation. The initial wall of water that tore through the valley was 10 feet high, a black, churning avalanche of mud-uprooted oak trees, shattered asphalt, and the crumpled remains of the county highway. The power grid failed instantly, plunging the entire Missouri River Valley into terrifying absolute darkness, illuminated only by the frantic sweeping beams of flashlights and the occasional eruption of a short-circuiting electrical transformer. Abbott Steves had been less than a mile from the breach. He barely made it to his truck. By the time he slammed his foot on the accelerator, the water was already swirling over his tires. He drove blindly through the storm, abandoning the sandbagging crew, who were scrambling up the remaining high ground. He reached his sprawling, picturesque estate just as the floodwaters crested his driveway. There was no time to save the tractors, the combines, or the livestock. Abbott, his wife, and their 2 teenage sons scrambled out the second-story window of their farmhouse and onto the slate roof, just as the first-floor windows shattered inward under the sheer pressure of the deluge. Clinging to the brick chimney in the freezing rain, Abbott watched his empire die. The floodwaters hit his immaculate, perfectly tilled fields and stripped the topsoil away in seconds. His colossal steel barns crumpled like tin cans, their reinforced beams groaning before snapping and vanishing beneath the frothing brown tide. Then the main current, a vicious, localized tidal wave loaded with the kinetic energy of thousands of tons of debris, barreled southward, straight toward the property line he shared with Margaret Halloway. From his vantage point on the roof, Abbott could see the silhouette of Margaret's wall in the occasional flash of lightning. He waited for the inevitable. He waited for the river to obliterate the ridiculous pile of rocks and wire that she had sacrificed her entire livelihood to build. But Margaret wasn't relying on hope. She had relied on math. When the massive surge of water and debris slammed into the northernmost point of Margaret's property, it didn't hit a flat, immovable surface. Flat surfaces absorb the full devastating perpendicular force of moving water, which is why Abbott's steel barns had collapsed instantly. Instead, the water struck the sharp, angled crescent of Margaret's gabion wall. The fluid dynamics of the structure immediately went to work. The zigzagging angles fractured the wave's kinetic energy, splitting the main force of the current and forcing it to deflect laterally. The massive jagged limestone rocks packed inside the galvanized wire cages acted as a violent friction brake. Instead of snapping under the pressure, the flexible gabion baskets slightly shifted and settled into the mud, absorbing the shock. Then came the debris, a tangled mass of massive cottonwood trunks, and the shattered remains of a neighbor's silo hurtled toward the wall. But before they could strike the stone, they hit the secondary baffles, the heavy earthen mounds Margaret had seeded with deep-rooted switchgrass and prairie cord grass. The dense 12-foot root systems held the soil together like subterranean rebar. The baffles acted as shock absorbers, catching the heavy debris and trapping it, creating an organic shield that further blunted the water's fury. Inside her farmhouse, sitting at her kitchen table by the light of a single kerosene lantern, Margaret Halloway listened to the apocalypse outside. She felt the ground vibrate beneath her boots. She heard the screech of tearing metal in the distance. But she did not move. She poured herself a cup of cold coffee from a thermos and watched the grandfather clock tick. By 3 a.m., the water levels reached the designed choke points of her wall. The hydraulic pressure was immense, threatening to push the structure over. But Margaret had planned for the overflow. The high tensile steel sluice gates she had sold her grandmother's diamonds to buy automatically yielded to the pressure opening, just enough to allow a controlled shallow sheet of water to flow into her designated spillway, a 40-acre sacrifice zone she had purposely left unplanted. The massive pressure was bled off safely, leaving her core farm entirely intact. Out in the darkness, the redirected current, stripped of its deadliest velocity, swept violently past her property and funneled harmlessly into the lower uninhabited marshlands to the south. Abbot Steeves remained on his roof until dawn, shivering and soaked to the bone. As the sun finally crested the horizon, casting a pale greyish light over Oakhaven, the true scale of the devastation was revealed. The town was gone. The valley was gone. In their place was a vast, terrifying inland sea of toxic brown water, dotted with the rooftops of submerged houses and the bloated carcasses of drowned cattle. But as Abbott looked to the south, his bloodshot eyes widened in absolute disbelief. Rising out of the apocalyptic floodwaters, perfectly preserved and defiant, was a massive peninsula of vibrant green. Margaret Halloway's farm stood completely untouched. The brutalist gabion wall, though battered, half-submerged and choked with debris, had held. It had wrapped its stony arms around her home, her barns, and her late-planted soybean fields, keeping the muddy abyss at bay. It was a fortress of engineering standing victorious in a graveyard of traditional farming. It took 3 weeks for the floodwaters to recede, enough for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to bring in heavy equipment and for the displaced citizens of Oakhaven to return to the wreckage of their lives. The smell of rotting vegetation, spilled diesel fuel, and stagnant mud hung heavy over the valley. The financial ruin was absolute. Generational farms had been wiped off the map. Abbot Steeves's 3,000 acres were buried under 2 feet of toxic river silt and sand, rendering the soil completely barren for years to come. The bank, facing a total collapse of the local agricultural economy, was paralyzed. In late July, Mayor Tayson Garrick, looking 10 years older and wearing mud-stained clothes, drove his FEMA-issued utility vehicle down the battered remains of County Road 9. Beside him sat Abbot Steeves. They were making damage assessments for the state governor. They pulled up to the edge of Margaret Halloway's property. The contrast was jarring, almost hallucinatory. While the rest of Oakhaven looked like the surface of a dead brown planet, Margaret's farm was an oasis of life. Her soybean crop was thriving, bright green and swaying in the summer breeze. Margaret was out by the perimeter, wearing her usual work boots and a faded cap, using a chainsaw to clear a massive oak tree that had wedged itself against one of her earthen baffles. She shut off the motor as Abbott and Garrick approached on foot. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than the humid Missouri air. The town had spent 4 years laughing at this woman. They had called her crazy, sued her, and waited for her to fail. Abbott stopped a few feet from the wall. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the galvanized steel wire tracing the edge of the limestone rock beneath it. He looked at the massive pile of debris tractors, roofs, trees that the wall had caught. Then Abbott noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. He traced the trajectory of the massive debris field trapped by Margaret's wall. He looked at the angle of the crescent, and then he looked back toward the town. If Margaret's wall had not been exactly where it was angled, exactly the way it was, the main current, and the hundreds of tons of crushing debris it carried, would not have been deflected into the southern marsh. It would have barreled straight into Oakhaven Elementary School. On the night of the flood, Oakhaven Elementary had been the designated emergency shelter. Over 300 people, including Abbott's own elderly mother, had been sleeping on cots in the gymnasium when the levee broke. The water had flooded the school's basement, but the building had stood. If the debris wave had hit it, the brick structure would have been pulverized. Margaret hadn't just engineered a fortress to save her own farm. She had calculated the topological flow of a catastrophic levee failure and built a wedge to shield the town's highest ground. She had protected the very people who had mocked her. "You knew," Abbott whispered, his voice cracking. He fell to his knees in the mud at the base of her wall, the arrogance that had defined his entire life entirely broken. "You knew the trajectory. You didn't just block the water. You steered it." Margaret wiped the sweat from her brow and rested the chainsaw against the stone. "Fluid dynamics, Abbott. Water is lazy. It takes the path of least resistance. You just have to give it a better option." Mayor Garrick took off his hat, his hands shaking. "Margaret, the bank." He swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "The county is bankrupt. The farms are gone. We have nothing left." Margaret looked out over the devastated valley, her expression softening. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand an apology for the lawsuit or the insults or the isolation. She was at her core a builder, and there was building to do. "My late-season soybeans are the only surviving cash crop within a 50-mile radius," Margaret said, quietly pulling a notepad from her pocket. "Because of the regional shortages, commodity prices are about to quadruple. It'll be a record yield financially." Garrick looked confused. "But it's only a few hundred acres. It's not enough to save the town." "It is if we use the capital to buy the heavy earth movers we need to scrape the silt off your fields before winter," Margaret replied, looking directly at Abbott. "I have the engineering blueprints for a modern terraced levee system that integrates with the natural floodplain, but I can't build it alone. I need a crew. I need farmers who know how to move earth." Abbott looked up at her tears, cutting tracks through the mud on his face. He nodded slowly. The town of Oakhaven never laughed at Margaret Halloway again. In the years that followed, she did not rebuild the town as it was. She rebuilt it as it should have been. The gabion walls became the architectural standard for the valley, a sprawling network of stone and steel that respected the river rather than blindly challenging it. Abbott Steves went to work for Margaret, trading his tailored suits for mud-stained denim, learning the mathematics of the land he had once thought he owned. They had called her wall a monument to madness. But when the waters finally cleared, It stood as the only monument to survival. What an incredible testament to the power of trusting your own knowledge when the rest of the world calls you crazy. Margaret's story proves that true vision often looks like madness to those who can't see the future. If you were captivated by this real-life tale of engineering resilience and ultimate vindication, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a brilliant underdog story, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical deep dives.